Ruth Wells stood at her corner on South Halsted Street, her weathered hands arranging sweet potato pies on a modest folding table. At 75 years old, her joints ached with every movement, not from weakness, but from the arthritis that had settled deep into her bones after 5 decades of standing, baking, and surviving. Her silver hair was wrapped in a bright floral headscarf, and despite the worn canvas shoes on her swollen feet, she held her head high. She had baked since 3 a.m. that morning. 3 full hours in her tiny kitchen, measuring ingredients she'd purchased with her meager Social Security check, following her late mother's recipes written in faded ink on grease-stained cards. All to sell enough desserts to cover the electricity bill that was already 2 weeks overdue. The only way she knew how to maintain her dignity in a world that had forgotten women like her. The street corner was crowded that Thursday afternoon, filled with rushing professionals who brushed past her table without a glance, conducting lives Ruth couldn't begin to understand. She felt invisible, but she had every right to be there. Her pies were honest work, baked with skill passed down through generations and determination forged through a lifetime of struggle. When she finally arranged the last peach cobbler just so, Ruth stepped back to admire her small display with quiet pride. She had no idea that the man in the tailored black suit standing across the street had been watching her since she'd set up her table, and she certainly didn't know that the city inspector walking toward her with a clipboard and a cruel smile was about to destroy everything. Like this video if you believe dignity has no price tag, and tell me what time it is and what city you're watching from. I love seeing our global community come together around these powerful stories. Subscribe to see what happens when power meets principle. Eugene Greenwood's smirk vanished the moment Friedrich Gonzalez spoke. "Inspector Greenwood," Friedrich said, his voice carrying across the street corner like silk wrapped around steel. "I believe you owe this woman an apology." The crowd that had been dispersing froze. Friedrich moved through them with the kind of presence that made people instinctively step aside, his charcoal gray suit immaculate, his dark eyes fixed on Greenwood with predatory focus. Behind him, 2 men in black suits materialized from a sleek Mercedes, their faces unreadable but their purpose clear. Greenwood's clipboard trembled in his hands. This is official city business. I don't know who you think you are, but I think," Friedrich interrupted, stepping so close that Greenwood had to crane his neck upward, "that you know exactly who I am. And I think you're going to pick up every single one of those pies you destroyed, apologize to Mrs. Wells, and write her a check for damages. Right now." The color drained from Greenwood's face. Ruth watched, stunned, as the man who'd mocked her livelihood moments ago dropped to his knees on the filthy sidewalk, frantically gathering her ruined desserts back onto the table with shaking hands. I apologize, ma'am. I was out of line. Completely out of line." "The check," Friedrich said coldly. $500 should cover her losses. "And Inspector? If I ever hear of you harassing street vendors in this neighborhood again, vendors who are simply trying to survive, you won't be worrying about your job. You'll be worrying about whether you can still use your hands to hold that clipboard." Greenwood scribbled out a personal check so quickly he nearly tore the paper, thrust it at Ruth with mumbled apologies, and fled down the street without looking back. The crowd began to whisper, phones appearing to capture what had just happened. Friedrich turned to Ruth, and his expression softened in a way that seemed almost impossible given what she'd just witnessed. "Mrs. Wells, are you hurt?" Ruth's hands still trembled as she clutched the check. Who are you?" "Someone who doesn't tolerate disrespect," Friedrich replied. He gestured toward his car. "Please, let me give you a ride home. It's not safe for you to be out here alone after this. People talk." "I don't even know you," Ruth protested, though her voice wavered. Everything in her screamed danger, the way people looked at him, the power he wielded with just words, the violence barely contained beneath his polished exterior. Friedrich reached into his jacket, and Ruth flinched before realizing he was simply retrieving a business card. "Friedrich Gonzalez," he said, offering it to her. "And you don't need to know me to accept help." Your table, your recipes, I saw the care you put into them. That deserves respect, not humiliation. Ruth looked down at the card, then at the destroyed remnants of her morning's work, then at this dangerous stranger who'd defended her when no one else would. Against every instinct of self-preservation she'd honed over 75 years, she found herself nodding. Just a ride home. Nothing more. Nothing more, Friedrich agreed, though something in his eyes suggested this was already far more than either of them understood. The Mercedes was more luxurious than any vehicle Ruth had ever been inside. Leather seats that seemed to embrace her aching body, tinted windows that made the chaotic city feel distant and dreamlike, and a silence so profound she could hear her own heartbeat. Friedrich sat beside her in the back seat, his security driving without a word. You didn't have to do that, Ruth said finally, breaking the quiet. I've handled worse than Eugene Greenwood. I'm sure you have, Friedrich replied, his gaze fixed on the passing buildings. But you shouldn't have to. Not at your age. Not after a lifetime of work. Ruth studied his profile, the sharp jawline, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the way his hands rested calmly on his knees despite the violence she'd witnessed in his words. Why did you really help me? Men like you don't stop for street vendors unless there's a reason. Friedrich was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight Ruth recognized, the kind that came from burying grief so deep you forgot it was there until something dragged it back to the surface. My mother sold flowers on street corners. Roses, mostly. She'd stand outside the Opera House on Michigan Avenue, trying to catch people in a good mood after shows. Ruth's expression softened. What happened to her? She died when I was 17, Friedrich said flatly. Pneumonia. She'd been standing in the rain for hours because we needed the money for rent. By the time I got her to a hospital, it was too late. He turned to look at Ruth directly. She died in poverty, exhausted and invisible, because people like that inspector believed women like her didn't matter. I'm sorry, Ruth said quietly. She understood loss, had worn it like a second skin since her husband passed 12 years ago. So when I see someone destroying another woman's livelihood, mocking her dignity because he has a clipboard and a badge, Friedrich's jaw tightened. I can't just walk away. They pulled up to Ruth's small house in Englewood, its paint peeling, but its porch swept clean. Friedrich reached into his jacket again, and this time produced an envelope. There's $10,000 here. Enough for permits, proper equipment, maybe a small storefront. No, Ruth said firmly, pushing the envelope back toward him. I appreciate what you did today, truly. But I don't take charity. I've made it 75 years on my own terms, and I won't start compromising that now. Not even for someone who defended me. Friedrich studied her with something that might have been respect. You're stubborn. I'm dignified, Ruth corrected. There's a difference. He smiled slightly, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him. Keep my card at least. In case you ever need anything. Not charity, just someone who understands what it means to fight for respect. Ruth took the card, knowing even as she slipped it into her worn purse that she'd never use it. This man was dangerous in ways that went far beyond street corner confrontations. The way people feared him, the power he wielded so casually, Friedrich Gonzalez lived in a world she wanted no part of. Thank you for the ride, she said, climbing out of the Mercedes. And for what you did. But our worlds don't mix, Mr. Gonzalez. Friedrich, he corrected gently. And you're probably right. As the Mercedes pulled away, Ruth stood on her porch watching it disappear, Friedrich's card burning a hole in her purse like a question she wasn't ready to answer. For weeks passed, and Friedrich's card remained buried in Ruth's purse, untouched. She returned to her corner, her pies selling steadily now that Eugene Greenwood had mysteriously transferred to a department in Springfield. Ruth didn't ask questions. Some answers were better left unknown. The Englewood Community Center's grand opening was the biggest catering job Ruth had landed in years. $300 to provide desserts for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, enough to cover 2 months of electricity. She arrived early that Saturday morning, arranging her pies and cobblers on tables decorated with bright tablecloths and fresh flowers, proud of how professional everything looked. Then she saw him. Friedrich stood near the entrance in a navy suit, speaking with the alderman and several people who looked like they belonged in boardrooms rather than community centers. His presence commanded the room the same way it had commanded that street corner: absolute, undeniable, dangerous. Their eyes met across the crowd. Friedrich's expression shifted from surprise to something warmer, but Ruth felt her stomach tighten with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. She turned back to her desserts, hoping he'd leave her alone. He didn't. "Mrs. Wells," Friedrich said, appearing beside her table with that same quiet confidence. "Your pies look extraordinary. What are you doing here?" Ruth asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Don't tell me you're suddenly interested in community development." "I donated the funds to renovate this building," Friedrich said simply. "Among other investments in this neighborhood." Ruth set down the pie she'd been arranging and turned to face him fully, her voice low but firm. "I know men like you, Mr. Gonzalez. I've buried enough of them, cousins, nephews, my own son. Men who thought power and money made them untouchable until they ended up in the ground before 40. Friedrich's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his dark eyes. "Your son." 23 years old, Ruth said, her voice steady despite the old wound. "Caught in someone else's war over territory that didn't even belong to any of them. So don't stand here acting like your donations wash the blood off your money." "You're right," Friedrich said quietly. "They don't. I'm not a good man, Mrs. Wells. I've done things that would make you see me as the monster I probably am. But that doesn't change the fact that I respect what you represent: dignity, honest work, refusing to surrender even when the world tries to make you invisible." "Respect?" Ruth's laugh was bitter. "You don't respect me. You see your dead mother when you look at me, and you're trying to save her ghost. That's not respect, that's guilt." Friedrich was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a rawness Ruth hadn't heard before. "Maybe. But does it matter why I helped you if the help was real?" "Yes," Ruth said firmly. "Because charity from guilt is just another form of pity, and I've spent my whole life refusing to be pitied." She paused, studying his face. "You want redemption? You won't find it through me. I can't absolve you of whatever keeps you awake at night." "I'm not asking for absolution," Friedrich replied. "I'm asking if dignity and survival have to be mutually exclusive. You've chosen dignity even when it cost you comfort. I've chosen survival even when it cost me my soul. Maybe we're both paying prices we shouldn't have to." Ruth wanted to walk away, to dismiss him and everything he represented. But something in his words resonated with the exhaustion she carried in her bones, the weariness of fighting alone for so long that pride had become armor she couldn't remove even when she wanted to. "Stay away from me," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "Your world and mine, they don't mix." "They already have," Friedrich said quietly, glancing toward the entrance where his security team stood watching. "Whether you called me or not." The gunshots shattered the ceremony like glass exploding. 3 men in black masks burst through the community center's main entrance, automatic weapons raised, shouting commands Ruth's mind couldn't process through the sudden roar of panic. Guests screamed, diving under tables, scrambling for exits that didn't exist. Friedrich moved before Ruth could even comprehend what was happening. His hand locked around her wrist with bruising force, pulling her down behind the dessert table as bullets tore through the decorative tablecloths above their heads. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice transformed from philosophical to lethal in a heartbeat. "Don't move. Don't look up." But Ruth had lived through the riots of '68, had survived her neighborhood's worst years. Fear didn't paralyze her the way it did the younger guests. She watched, frozen not by terror but by horrified fascination, as Friedrich's security team materialized like shadows given form. What happened next lasted maybe 30 seconds, but felt suspended in time. Friedrich's men moved with military precision, their weapons appearing as if conjured from thin air. The community center became a battleground, controlled, efficient, terrifyingly professional. One of the masked assailants went down with a bullet to the shoulder. Another dropped his weapon, hands raised in surrender before being slammed face-first into the floor with a force that made Ruth wince. The third attacker managed to fire again, and Ruth heard someone cry out in pain, a young woman near the stage, clutching her leg, blood spreading across the polished floor. Ruth moved without thinking. She pushed past Friedrich's restraining hand, crawling toward the injured woman despite the chaos still unfolding around her. "I said stay down." Friedrich's voice cracked with something Ruth had never heard from him before, genuine fear. "She's bleeding out," Ruth shot back, reaching the woman and pressing her headscarf against the wound with practiced hands. She'd been a nurse's aide for 15 years before arthritis forced her into other work. "Someone get me something to tie this with." One of Friedrich's men appeared beside her with a belt, but it was Friedrich himself who dropped to his knees next to Ruth, his expensive suit forgotten as he helped apply pressure to the wound. His hands were steady, but when Ruth glanced at his face, she saw his carefully constructed mask had cracked completely. He wasn't looking at the injured woman, he was looking at Ruth with an expression of raw terror that had nothing to do with the violence around them. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking someone needed help," Ruth replied, her own hands shaking now as the adrenaline began to fade. Around them, Friedrich's security had subdued all three attackers, zip-tying their wrists with efficient brutality. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Friedrich's second-in-command approached, a man Ruth vaguely recognized from the Mercedes, tall, with a scar across his cheek. "Sosa, get Mrs. Wells out of here," Friedrich ordered. "Back in trance. Now." "I'm not leaving these people," Ruth protested. "Yes, you are," Friedrich said, his voice returning to that cold authority. But his hand on her shoulder was gentle, almost pleading. "This was about me, Ruth. They came here because I was here. And if they saw you with me," he stopped himself, jaw clenched. "Please, let me get you somewhere safe." Ruth looked around at the chaos, overturned tables, broken glass, terrified faces, and the three subdued men who'd brought war into a place meant for hope. This was Friedrich's world. Not donations and renovations, but violence and blood and the kind of power that solved problems with bullets. She should have refused. Should have stayed with the injured, given statements to police, maintained her distance from this dangerous man and his dangerous life. Instead, she found herself nodding, letting Sosa guide her toward the back exit, Friedrich's hand never leaving her shoulder until she was safely outside. Friedrich's penthouse office overlooked Lake Michigan, all floor-to-ceiling windows and leather furniture that probably cost more than Ruth's house. She sat in a chair that seemed designed to swallow her whole, a cup of tea she hadn't touched cooling on the glass table beside her. Sosa stood by the door like a silent sentinel while Friedrich paced, his suit jacket discarded, his pristine shirt now bearing traces of blood from the injured woman they'd helped. "His name is Harry Bourgeois," Friedrich said finally, stopping to face Ruth. "He controls the North Side operations, drugs, gambling, extortion. We've been at war for territory for the past 6 months. And he attacked a community center opening?" Ruth's voice was hollow. "Where families and children were supposed to be celebrating." "He attacked me," Friedrich corrected, his expression hardening. The location didn't matter to him. What mattered was making a statement that nowhere I go is safe, that anyone associated with me becomes collateral damage. He paused, and something vulnerable crossed his face. "He knows I was there because of you, Ruth." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Because of me?" Word travels fast in my world. A powerful man publicly defends an elderly street vendor, shows up at an event she's catering, stands beside her while bullets fly. People notice. And people like Harry Bourgeois use what they notice as weapons. Ruth's hands trembled as she set down the untouched tea. "So what you're telling me is that knowing you has put a target on my back. Yes, Friedrich said simply. No softening, no excuses. That's exactly what I'm telling you. And it will only get worse if we continue to have contact. Harry won't stop with one failed attempt. He'll look for any vulnerability he can exploit, and right now, you're perceived as mine. The possessiveness in that last word should have angered Ruth, but instead, she just felt tired, bone-deep exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with her 75 years. I survived this long without your kind of chaos, Mr. Gonzalez. I buried my son because of men exactly like you and Harry Bourgeois. I won't spend whatever time I have left looking over my shoulder, wondering if today's the day someone uses me to hurt you. Friedrich nodded slowly, and if Ruth didn't know better, she'd say he looked relieved. I understand. It's the smart choice. The safe choice. Then we're done here, Ruth said, standing with as much dignity as her aching joints would allow. Thank you for the tea. And first she gestured vaguely, unable to find words for the complicated tangle of gratitude, fear, and something else she refused to name. For everything. But I want you to stay away from my corner, my neighborhood, my life. Of course, Friedrich agreed. Then, quieter. For what it's worth, meeting you reminded me that not everything in this world is corrupt or corruptible. That meant something. Ruth walked to the door where Sosa waited to escort her out. She didn't look back, didn't let herself acknowledge the unexpected ache in her chest that felt like loss for something that had never really begun. What Ruth didn't know, what Friedrich didn't tell her as she left, was that he'd already assigned a protection detail. 2 of his most trusted men would shadow Ruth every day, invisible but vigilant, ensuring Harry Bourgeois would never get close enough to use her as a weapon. It wasn't respect for her wishes. It was the only form of caring Friedrich knew how to express, silent, secret, absolute. As the elevator doors closed on Ruth's tired face, Friedrich returned to the window, staring out at the city sprawled below. Doing the right thing had never felt so much like failure. Keeping her safe meant letting her go, and letting her go felt like losing the one person who'd seen past his monster to find something worth defending. In the elevator, Ruth clutched her purse where Friedrich's card still rested, untouched and now permanently forbidden. She'd made the right choice. The safe choice. So why did safety feel so much like loneliness? 3 weeks of blessed normalcy passed. Ruth returned to her corner, sold her pies, came home to her quiet house. She never saw the men watching from the coffee shop across the street, never noticed how the same dark sedan always seemed parked within view of her table. Friedrich kept his word about staying away, or so she thought. Dusk came early in late October. Ruth was packing up her unsold cobblers, humming an old hymn her mother used to sing, when the van pulled up. She barely registered the side door sliding open before hands grabbed her, yanking her inside with brutal efficiency. Her scream died against a chemical-soaked cloth pressed over her mouth, and the world dissolved into darkness. She woke to pain. Her left eye wouldn't open fully, swollen shut from a blow she couldn't remember receiving. Each breath sent fire through her ribs. Her hands were zip-tied behind a metal chair in what looked like an abandoned warehouse, concrete floors, rusted machinery, and the smell of old oil and something worse. Finally awake, a voice said from the shadows. A man emerged into the single hanging light bulb's glow, late 50s, expensive suit now wrinkled, graying hair slicked back. His smile held no warmth, only calculation. Mrs. Ruth Wells. Friedrich's little pet project. I don't know what you're talking about, Ruth managed, her voice raspy. Don't insult my intelligence. Harry Bourgeois crouched in front of her, his breath reeking of cigars and whiskey. You think I don't know everything about you? 75 years old, widowed, one dead son lost to the streets. You're nobody. Nothing. Just an old woman who should have had the sense to stay invisible. Then why am I here? Ruth asked, though she already knew the answer. Because Friedrich Gonzalez sees something in you. God knows what, probably reminds him of his dead whore mother. Harry's laugh was cruel. But whatever the reason, you matter to him. And that makes you useful to me. The hours that followed blurred together, Harry's taunts about her worthlessness, her age, how even her own son hadn't loved her enough to stay alive. He never hit her again, didn't need to. The psychological torture was more efficient, each word designed to strip away the dignity Ruth had fought her entire life to maintain. She thought about Friedrich's warning, about how she'd chosen safety over connection. Some choice that had been. Then she heard it, gunfire, shouting, the sound of metal doors being torn from hinges. Harry's expression shifted from smug confidence to genuine fear in the space of a heartbeat. How did he? The warehouse door exploded inward. Friedrich stormed through like a force of nature, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt splattered with blood that clearly wasn't his. His security team fanned out behind him with military precision, but Friedrich himself moved with singular focus, a predator that had found its prey and wouldn't stop until there was nothing left to threaten what it protected. Get away from her. Friedrich's voice was barely human, a growl that promised violence beyond Ruth's comprehension. Harry raised his hands, backing away, but his false bravado remained. She's just an old woman, Friedrich. Is she really worth starting a war over? Friedrich didn't answer with words. He moved with terrifying speed, his fist connecting with Harry's jaw with a crack that made Ruth flinch. Harry went down hard, and Friedrich followed him, blow after calculated blow, rage given physical form. Friedrich, stop. Ruth's voice cut through the violence. Stop, please. He froze mid-strike, his knuckles bloody, chest heaving. When he looked at Ruth, his eyes held something wild and broken fury and fear tangled so completely she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I've got you, he said, his voice shaking as he moved to cut her restraints. You're safe now. I've got you. Ruth collapsed against him, every wall she'd built crumbling as tears finally came. Friedrich held her like she was something precious and fragile, his bloodied hands impossibly gentle against her silver hair. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. The Mercedes felt different this time, no longer luxurious sanctuary, but rolling confessional. Ruth sat wrapped in Friedrich's suit jacket, an ice pack pressed against her swollen eye, every breath still sending spikes of pain through her bruised ribs. Friedrich sat beside her, his bloodied knuckles wrapped in gauze, staring at nothing. You had people watching me, Ruth said finally. It wasn't a question. From the moment you left my office, Friedrich admitted. 2 rotating shifts, 24 hours a day. They were supposed to keep you safe. His jaw clenched. Obviously, they failed. How did Harry get past them? He used a decoy, staged a fight 3 blocks away to draw them off. By the time they realized it was a distraction, you were already gone. Friedrich turned to face her, and Ruth had never seen anyone look so haunted. I should have assigned more men. Should have told you so you could have been more careful. Should have let me live my life, Ruth interrupted quietly. Like I asked you to. Yes, Friedrich agreed. But I couldn't. And now you have a choice to make, Ruth, because this doesn't end here. Harry Bourgeois will recover from what I did to him tonight, and when he does, he'll come after you again. Or one of my other enemies will. You're marked now, whether you want to be or not. Ruth's hands trembled as she lowered the ice pack. What choice? I can set you up with new identity, new city, enough money that you'll never have to work again. Witness protection through channels I control. You'd be completely disconnected from me, from Chicago, from everything. Safe. He paused. Or you stay. Under my protection, in my world. Bodyguards, secure housing, everything you need. But it means accepting that danger will always be near, and so will I. Those are both prison sentences, Ruth observed. One where I lose everything I know, one where I surrender every bit of independence I have left. I know, Friedrich said softly. I'm sorry. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows. Then she straightened despite the pain, her voice firm. If I stay, and I'm not saying I will, I need the truth. All of it. No more pretty lies about investments and business interests. I want to know exactly who you are and what you've done. Friedrich's expression shuddered, but he nodded slowly. All right. Who is Friedrich Gonzalez really? He took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice was flat, clinical, a man reciting his own rap sheet. I control the largest drug trafficking operation in the Midwest. Heroin, cocaine, fentanyl. If it destroys lives, I profit from it. I run protection rackets in 40 neighborhoods, extort money from businesses that can't afford to say no. I've ordered the deaths of 17 men, carried out 5 of those executions personally. I own judges, police captains, aldermen, state senators. I've been building this empire for 23 years, since I was 19 years old and angry enough at the world to burn it down. Ruth listened without flinching, though each confession landed like a blow. I launder money through legitimate businesses, ruin competitors who won't fall in line, and use violence as casually as most people use conversation. Friedrich's dark eyes met hers, unflinching. I'm not a good man, Ruth. I'm not even a man trying to be good who sometimes fails. I'm the monster parents warn their children about. The reason people like Harry Bourgeois exist is because people like me created the world that made them possible. Are you trying to scare me away? Ruth asked. Yes, Friedrich admitted. Because you deserve better than this. Better than me. Ruth studied his face, the man who'd defended her dignity, who'd stormed a warehouse to save her, who'd just confessed to decades of violence and corruption with brutal honesty. Maybe I do deserve better, she said quietly. But maybe deserving and choosing aren't the same thing. Friedrich's breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying I won't run. I won't leave Chicago, won't abandon my life because evil men make evil choices. Ruth's voice strengthened. But I also won't pretend I don't understand what staying means. So here's my choice. I stay. Under your protection. In your world. But Friedrich, if I'm going to live with this monster, then the monster is going to have to live with me too. The brownstone in Lincoln Park became Ruth's new home, 3 stories of restored elegance with accessible features Friedrich had installed within days. Security cameras, reinforced doors, a panic room Ruth prayed she'd never need. But also, a modern kitchen where she could bake without her knees screaming, a bedroom with a bed that didn't aggravate her arthritis, and most surprisingly, an office on the 2nd floor. I don't need an office, Ruth had protested when Friedrich showed her the room with its large desk and new computer. You do if you're going to help me figure out what to do with money I shouldn't have, Friedrich had replied. I have accountants for the illegal operations. I need someone with a conscience for everything else. 6 months later, Ruth sat in that office reviewing proposals for a youth job training center, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she made notes on a tablet. At 75, she'd learned technology out of sheer stubbornness, refusing to let age be an excuse for ignorance. Video calls with community organizers, spreadsheets tracking investments in after-school programs, databases of families needing assistance. Ruth had become Friedrich's bridge between his dark empire and the light he was trying to create at its edges. The Englewood Center needs more funding, Ruth said without looking up as Friedrich entered her office. She learned to sense his presence, the way the air seemed to shift when he was near. The HVAC system is 30 years old. These kids deserve better than broken heating in winter. Approved, Friedrich said, settling into the chair across from her desk. What else? The scholarship fund. We need to increase it by 40% to cover the applications we're receiving. Ruth finally looked at him over her glasses. 40%, Friedrich. That's how many young people are trying to escape the world you profit from. The observation would have offended most men. Friedrich just nodded. Done. Anything else? Yes. Ruth set down her tablet. There's a woman downstairs. Sosa said she's been waiting an hour to see you. Something about protection money her family can't afford. Friedrich's expression hardened. That's Marco's territory. He knows the rules about. The rules don't matter if they're destroying families, Ruth interrupted. See her. Listen to her. And remember that your mother was once exactly like her, desperate, scared, and trying to protect her child. Friedrich was silent for a moment, then stood. "Come with me." They found the woman in the first-floor sitting room, mid-30s, exhausted eyes, holding a sleeping toddler against her chest. She stood quickly when Friedrich entered, fear evident in every line of her body. "Mrs. Ramirez," Friedrich said, his voice gentler than Ruth had heard him use in business contexts. "I understand you're having difficulty with your payments." "My husband lost his job," the woman said, her voice breaking. "The factory closed." "We're trying, Mr. Gonzalez. I swear we're trying. But we can't. We have 3 children and the baby needs medicine and—" "How much do you owe?" Friedrich asked. $1,800. "But if we could just have more time." "The debt is forgiven," Friedrich said. Ruth watched something shift in his expression, saw him seeing not a debtor but a person. "All of it. And Mrs. Ramirez here." He pulled out his phone, typed rapidly. "I've just transferred $5,000 to the account you have on file with us. For the baby's medicine, for groceries, for whatever you need while your husband finds new work." The woman stared, disbelieving. "I don't understand." "Someone recently reminded me that I have choices about what kind of man I want to be," Friedrich said, glancing at Ruth. "Consider this me making a better choice." After Mrs. Ramirez left, sobbing with gratitude, Ruth returned to Friedrich's side. "That money came from somewhere dark," she observed quietly. "Drug sales, extortion, violence." "I know," Friedrich replied. "But you just used it to save a family." Ruth took his hand, something she rarely did, but the moment seemed to demand it. "You can't undo the past, Friedrich. Can't bring back the people hurt by your empire. But you can build a different future, one choice at a time. That has to count for something." "Does it?" Friedrich asked, and for once he sounded genuinely uncertain. "Does doing good with bad money actually make me any less of a monster?" "No," Ruth said honestly. "But it makes you a monster trying to be human. And that's more than most monsters ever attempt." Friedrich looked at their joined hands, his scarred and stained with violence he could never wash away, hers weathered by 75 years of honest survival. "You've been invisible your whole life," he said, echoing words Ruth had spoken months ago. "But I see you. That has to be enough." "It is," Ruth replied. "And I see you too, Friedrich. All of you, the darkness and the light you're trying to build inside it. That's enough too." Ruth stood at her street corner on a Thursday morning, just like she had for years, but everything had changed. The folding table was new, sturdy, professional, with a proper canopy bearing the logo Ruth's Heritage Recipes. The permits were laminated and displayed prominently. And parked discreetly half a block away sat one of Friedrich's security team in an unmarked car, watching. She'd traveled an impossible distance from that humiliating afternoon when Eugene Greenwood had destroyed her pies and her dignity. The news had broken 2 weeks ago, the former city inspector arrested on 43 counts of extortion, bribery, and abuse of power. An anonymous tip had led federal investigators to years of documented corruption. Ruth didn't ask how Friedrich had acquired those documents. Some questions still had answers she preferred not to know. But she knew this. She mattered now in ways that went beyond survival. The community centers bearing her input, the scholarships funded through her oversight, the families helped because she'd convinced a mob boss that mercy could coexist with power. These were her legacy. At 75, Ruth Wells had finally found purpose beyond simply enduring. A familiar Mercedes pulled up to the curb. Friedrich emerged in his typical immaculate suit, drawing curious glances from passers-by who recognized power even when they couldn't name it. He approached Ruth's table with that slight smile he reserved only for her. "Mrs. Wells," he greeted formally, though his eyes held warmth. "I'll take 2 peach cobblers and a sweet potato pie." "That's a lot of dessert for one man," Ruth observed, carefully boxing his order. "One's for me. The rest are for a meeting." Friedrich's expression turned wry. "Turns out offering people your grandmother's recipes makes negotiations go smoother than threats." "Who knew?" "I did," Ruth said. "That's why you keep me around." That's one reason, Friedrich agreed quietly. He handed her cash, always more than the pie's cost, and Ruth had stopped arguing about it months ago. Some battles weren't worth fighting. Same time next week? I'll be here, Ruth promised. She watched him drive away, this dangerous, complicated man who'd somehow become her unlikely friend and protector. They'd both been transformed by their collision. She'd gained security and purpose. He'd found something resembling redemption. Neither was fully healed. Ruth still woke some nights gasping from nightmares of that warehouse. Friedrich still ran an empire built on suffering. But they were trying, together, to be better than their circumstances had made them. An elderly man approached her table, counting coins carefully. Ruth recognized the look, social security stretched too thin, pride warring with hunger. She wrapped up a cobbler and handed it to him. No charge today, she said gently. Consider it a blessing passed forward. The man's eyes filled with tears. God bless you, ma'am. Ruth watched him walk away and felt something she hadn't experienced in the 12 years since her husband's death, genuine contentment. Not happiness exactly, because her life was still complicated, still touched by danger and moral ambiguity. But she felt seen, valued, purposeful. She'd spent 75 years being invisible, fighting to maintain dignity in a world determined to strip it away. Now she stood protected by a monster who'd remembered his humanity because she'd refused to let him forget it. And in protecting her, Friedrich had found someone who saw past his crimes to the man still capable of choosing mercy. They'd saved each other in ways neither had expected. Ruth arranged another pie on her table, humming the same hymn her mother had taught her decades ago. The autumn sun was warm on her face, her permits were legitimate, her future was uncertain, but no longer lonely. For the first time in 12 years, Ruth Wells felt truly seen. And that was enough. Like this video if you believe everyone deserves dignity, regardless of age or circumstances. Comment below and tell me what time it is and what city you're watching from. I love seeing our global community come together around these powerful stories. Subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of unexpected redemption, unlikely friendships, and the transformative power of respect. Drop a comment telling me, would you have made Ruth's choice? Would you have stayed, or would you have run? Your perspective matters to me. Share it below. ****.